There's many artists who make music from a spiritual lens. Last week we were speaking about how you get inspiration as an artist from the dream realm. Now, what does this look like? What does this mean? What does it actually mean for us and for you if you've actually been inspired by a dream? Now, if you remember the video that I posted last week on the theta state creativity and how it can be a spiritual thing to tap into something that hasn't existed before to create something that's new. Now, I would surmise and I would suppose that a lot of this comes from a spiritual influence, not just our subconscious. Because, hey, if it's something that's coming from our subconscious, likely something that we've already consumed before that is now being brought up to the forefront. So a couple of people asked a few good questions and made a few good comments on the video that I posted. And I'm going to read out the comments to you because I think that they're very good questions. And I think that's something that we actually might need to think about. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Dion said, "We contain libraries to our ancestors, and we are earthly and ethereal guides. When we listen with different ears, we will hear them. Their gift is beyond sight." What I believe that Dion is referring to is that our ancestors and spirits that came before us, people that we're connected to, can guide us through certain things, can guide us through life, and knowing a certain part of our lives, maybe our past lives and even our family's lives, that we can tap into that knowledge that was there before and that can teach us a lot about what is today. So I believe that's true, but what I don't necessarily believe is that those ancestors can give you inspiration to develop something that's new, right? Remember, we're talking about creativity and inspiration to create and to build something that's new. Now, I'm going to read another comment by Naima, or Sincerely Spoken, and she asked a very good question. In fact, this is what we're going to be talking about today. And her question is, how can you tell if it's not a subconscious thing? What evidence exists of these spiritual guides? That's a very good question, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, which is it really spiritual guides, or is it just a subconscious thing that we're digging up from a past conscious memory or a past memory that we're now bringing out to the forefront? So I'll explain briefly why I don't believe that it's a subconscious thing, because if it's something that is part of our subconscious, it means that this is something that really we've already experienced, already heard, already seen at some point, but not consciously observed, right? This means there's something that you might have seen, consumed, or heard, but not registered in your waking mind, right? We talked about the beta state being your waking consciousness, your waking mind, when you're actually thinking about things and you're able to think and recall and remember something because you're conscious and alert. Now, the theta state is something when we are dreaming, when we're in a realm where we're not fully conscious, but we're probably a little bit aware of what's going on, right? You could call this lucid dreaming or astral projection. And if you want to know more about that, then we're going to dive into that as well. We spoke about inspiration and inspiration that comes from this dream state, from this dream realm. So here's the thing, Naima. I think if it's purely subconscious, it has to be something that you've already heard, something that you've already seen, something that exists already. Maybe you create something and you have a melody that comes in your mind, and this is a melody that you've been hearing subconsciously, maybe through songs, and then it comes back in your mind. And of course, this can be something that comes from your subconscious. But what we're specifically talking about, and what I specifically was referring to when it came to the theta state and dream realms, is creating something that's completely new, building something that is completely never been seen, that's never been heard of, that is completely original and authentic in its design and its thought and its philosophy. And this is the inspiration that comes from the theta state. Now, I want to talk about three things particularly that I think maybe will break this down a little bit easier for us. As Dion's comment mentioned, that there is some inspiration from our ancestral guides, people who we're connected to. That means that there's people who believe that our ancestors and our guides actually allow us to go through this world and understand it better. We're going to dive a bit deeper again here. We're going to go into the spiritual things. So if you're not spiritual, forgive me, but I'm going to talk about spiritual things. There's a story about a woman who was constantly having miscarriages. And as she was having these miscarriages, she didn't know why she was having these miscarriages until she actually went to a church. And at the church, they told her that there was a spiritual sacrifice that was done in your family. And because of this sacrifice, there was something that was on you that you needed to figure out. And then she went and she spoke to her father. And when she spoke to her father, she then realized that there was a spirit that was dedicated to every single woman that was in that family, and that spirit would move from one person to another, to the next, to another, in every generation, and that spirit was what was causing her to miscarry. Now, I'm not going to go into the story in further detail, but if you do want to know more about that story, then leave a comment and let me know, and I'll probably dive into that another time. But that was a sad story of how our ancestral guides and things that can happen from the past can influence you negatively. That's not to say that it only happens negatively. I believe that ancestral guides can also empower you to do things that are positive, right? That when you have, for example, a great-grandfather or a father even who was passed and gone through from one life to the next, people have spoken about having visitations from their mother or their father or their grandfather, someone they were close to. And then these people come back and tell them something or comfort them in their time of need. So having ancestral guides, people from your past, your fathers, your mothers, your grandmothers, your grandfathers, can be a thing that brings us comfort. And I know other people are going to say the same thing, that, hey, this is just your subconscious remembering their memory and then creating this narrative around that. That's also possible. So this is why I always say that when it comes to figuring out whether it's a spiritual or subconscious thing, we have to look at a couple of things. We have to look at actually what ideas and downloads we're getting, and we have to look at whether they're things that we already kind of know, they're feelings that we already had maybe. Last week I spoke about sometimes when you go to sleep, how to enter into a theta state is to go to sleep meditating upon the thing that you want to think about or the problem that you want to solve, right? Not actually trying to solve the problem, but just thinking about the problem, just kind of meditating on it. And then that by going to sleep, this allows your untapped mind, your untapped consciousness to actually dive deeper into things that you probably know but aren't fully conscious of, and then that way you can get the answers in your dream state. Again, I spoke about how this is a very tricky thing to do. It's not something that I would just advise you to do lightly, because I also believe that when you're in this dream state, you're actually vulnerable spiritually as well. I spoke about understanding your spiritual voice, understanding your spiritual guides, and having discernment of the spirits whilst you're in this realm. So don't dive into this lightly. Tread very carefully and make sure that you are covered and protected spiritually first before you try anything of this nature, right? So I was going to talk about three things, as I mentioned. The first thing was the ancestral guides, which I've already spoken about. The second thing was the past lives. So there's certain people that believe that we have had certain past experiences, past lives, if you like, and that through these past lives, we come into this world with an experience already. So you might know someone who was born and they just know how to play an instrument, or they have a great intuitive nature about music or art or mathematics or science or sport, right? There's just something about them that when they start to do this particular thing, they're just so good at it. They're much better at understanding it than everyone else is. And this person can be so young, they can be called a prodigy because maybe without being taught, they just pick up an instrument or instruments and just start playing them. And then people will say, for example, wow, this child has got an old soul. You've heard that several times. And I believe that this is a possibility as well, that sometimes we can tap into our past lives. Now, why do I say that? Now, I say that because I think that everyone who's born in this earth and everyone that comes on this planet has a mission to complete. That when you're born, you actually know what that mission is. But as with all things, right, with life and with schooling, with education, with life experiences and our own families, sometimes we lose sight of the thing that we were meant to do. And this means that we now turn away from the thing that we're born to do, and we start to do things that the society expects us to do. Now, if you haven't watched my video on identity crisis and understanding your gifts, talents, and skills, and how this can help you to regain your purpose, to understand your purpose, and to reconnect with your purpose again, then I advise you to watch it. I'm going to put a link in the description here. So check that video out, because that can be very, very enlightening for you. I think it will help you to regain and to reconnect yourself with your purpose again. So let's talk about this past lives thing. Now, if you've had past lives, right, and you maybe have a remembrance of things that you used to do in the past, this means that perhaps when you get to a certain age in your life, that you find yourself being drawn to doing something, being drawn to doing charity, being drawn to a certain career maybe, being drawn to a certain art or something of that nature, a certain group of people. And then when you do this, you will find an instant connection with that thing. And then it'll be like your life will change. You've heard people say someone's having a midlife crisis, or someone's having an epiphany in their life where they just, after working in the bank for so long that they just happen to leave that bank situation, and then they went and started doing something maybe in the farm. And then they'll find that that's where they really, really thrived. So it's not uncommon for people to find themselves, find their purpose later in life. And I would say that if you haven't had the practice of trying to connect with yourself, remember I talked about the first spiritual principle that I follow always with regards to knowing anything that's spiritual is connecting with yourself. And if you've never done that, then take some time to try and connect with yourself, because this is how you can really figure out what your purpose is in life, what your gifts are, what your talents are, what your skills are, and what you're here to give the world. So if you reconnect with your purpose, you can also find inspiration. Let's say, for example, a certain part of your brain was dormant. Maybe it's a creative muscle. Maybe it's a muscle that wants to connect more with people. And this muscle was dormant throughout your whole life. And then at some point in a dream state, in that theta state, you go to sleep, and in your subconscious, a past life experience comes back and starts to show up in your life, starts to show up in your dreams. And then all of a sudden you start having synchronicities in your life. People start coming out and talking about the same thing. And then you think to yourself, what's happening here, right? This, in my opinion, is your subconscious, is maybe possibly your past life, trying to give you hints of the things that you should be doing. So I'd say pay attention to that for sure. Now, the difference between this and moving forward in your life to understand more between having a theta state experience or an experience from a spiritual guide is that when you're having these past life experiences, again, you are remembering things that may be new to you, but they are part of your psyche. Right? That's that collective consciousness. It may be something from your ancestral or your past life in your personal life, right? So that's how I believe that this can be a connection that comes from a life that you were born with before, and an understanding of a spiritual life that you had before that you are now carrying on in this life. So you might find people that are born with a certain desire to do good in certain areas, or to be a firefighter, or to be in charity or anything of that nature. And then they have this unbelievable drive to do this thing that they never quite rest. And they can't quite rest until they achieve this thing. I think that's part of their past life mission that they maybe not have completed in the previous life. So it's important to pay attention to that. And if you have kids, I'd advise you to speak to them and try and figure out, try and find out, try and draw out of them this thing that they were born with, and just ask them in conversation, hey, what do you want to do? You know, instead of just looking at the subjects that they're doing at school and what they're good at school, actually dive into who they are as people and try and find out. Maybe they might tell you who they were in their past life, and that might lead to an actual interesting conversation about what their purpose is in this life. But this still doesn't explain inspiration that gives you new ideas, new creative ideas of things that don't exist today. Remember, we're talking about theta state creativity. And when we're talking about this, we're not just talking about things that are new to you. We're talking about things that are new in general. We're talking about new inventions, things that have not existed on Earth. These are things that actually come from a high realm. So I want to talk about the third level of connection, which I believe personally is where we have this breakthrough, this innovation, this invention of new things, this creativity that comes and gives us inspiration of songs that have never been heard before. And I think this comes from a source that is available to all of us, a source that we're connected to, but a source that we're not always aware of, right? There's certain times and certain manners and in certain experiences that I've had where something has been happening in my life. And somebody who I haven't spoken to for years literally called me the very next morning and said to me, I had a dream about you. And in this dream, this happened and that happened and this happened. And this is what's going to happen. And I was like, wow, this person just told me exactly what was happening last night. They told me where I was today. And they told me about what's going to happen in the future. Now, they have no way of knowing that. This is not even someone I was particularly close to. And I'd say that they have no way of knowing that because I hadn't spoken to them for years. They didn't know what was going on in my life, but they just seemed to know that I needed to hear that. And when they called me, the thing that had literally happened the night before no longer became a problem for me, no longer became so painful for me to deal with because I had gotten the answer and somebody had comforted me in that moment. How could they have known that I was suffering? I kid you not. I hadn't spoken to them for years. This person just knew me purely by acquaintance. Bear in mind that I'd never spoken to this person for years. And this person wasn't even a good friend of mine. We just were acquainted and we had mutual friends, but they thought they would call me and tell me this thing. What is that? Where's that coming from? What is this connection that brought us together unconsciously? Now, I can't say that's a past life because a past life is only to do with me. I can't say that this is an ancestral guide because me and that person were not related. Now, I've experienced this more than once. I've had it happen to me. I've had it happen to other people where some people have dreamt about me. And I've had it the other way around when I've dreamt about other people. And I've told them about what's happening in their life currently and what they're going to experience as well in the future. So I think this is quite an amazing thing. This is what I believe in is the connection that we all have to what you might call the universe, what I call God. Right? So we have different names for this. Some people call it God. Some people call it the universe, Mother Earth, whatever you want to call it. But I believe that this consciousness that we have a connection to, this is the spiritual aspect. This is the thing that sees the past, the present, and the future of our lives. And so when you're trying to figure out in this realm, in this theta state realm, this dream state realm, who is this inspiration? What is this inspiration? Where is it coming from? I would just say to you, keep your eyes on God. Keep your eyes on that connection. Keep your eyes on the source. And when you keep your eyes on the source, you'll never run dry. Right? Because that's a living water that just has an abundant source of resources. Sorry to use the word source all the time, but an abundant wealth in terms of resources and creativity that is untapped, that would allow you to create songs forever and ever and ever. It's the same thing that inspires people to write new books and to create new things. Now, as I said to you last week, this source exists in two parts, right? I think that there's a source which applies to us or applies to human beings that we can tap into to create a positive change. And likewise, there's a source that we can also tap into to create a negative change, right? So I would look at it this way. Sometimes you can have a source which inspires you to do something that's positive, something that moves us forward, right? Creating medicine perhaps, or science that moves the human race forward and that gives life to people. That's a positive influence. And you can also have a source that influences you to do something that's negative, creating bombs, for example, and creating things that might hurt people, right? So not all creativity is good creativity. Now, how can you tell what creativity is good creativity? How can you tell what source is a good source and what source is a bad source? Here's what I'll say. Whenever I've been interacting with people, and I've spoken to people sometimes who I've met, and I've thought to myself, you know what, me and this person, from an ideological perspective, or from an ideological standpoint, or from a cultural standpoint, we come from the same background, we come from the same school, maybe we go to the same organization, and when I was religious, maybe we went to the same church. But I would meet certain people who I'll be like, man, you know what, for some reason I just don't get along with this person. What is it? And sometimes this person I didn't get along with was the person who was like a senior member of the church, like a pastor or a preacher, whatever the case is. And I'll be like, am I the one that's wrong here? Because you're taught that the pastor and the preacher is righteous and, you must agree with him. But something just didn't connect with us spiritually. And this is very strange to me because I felt like, you know what, I don't understand quite how I just have conflict with this person, that we didn't even verbally have conflict sometimes. It wasn't like I was disagreeing with him verbally or physically, but it's just when you look at someone, I don't know if this happens to you, when you look at someone and you just kind of wary, you're just like, this person's a bit off to me. I don't know. I just feel like I should be careful around this person. And there was this thing which I just kind of felt like, this is just not right. This is something not right about this person. And so as time moved on, you then learn that person actually treated people sometimes very poorly and said some things which are very negative. And then I had my own experience with that person as well. And then I was like, oh, so that person actually wasn't righteous. And I'd say this the same way, that when I meet people who are of a different religion or of a different spiritual practice or of a different culture, different background, and you meet these people, and on paper, we shouldn't get along. But then we start speaking and I'm like, wow, this person, I actually vibe with them. We have a good connection. And that a lot of things that they believe in are actually the things that I believe in as well. They might call themselves a Muslim, they might call themselves a Hindu, Buddhist, whatever the case, but we have the same belief system. What is that about? I think we're tapping into the same source. So when we look at the judging, right, discerning, remember I spoke about tapping into the spiritual is very important. And one of the key important things is discerning what source, what spiritual power, what spiritual source that person is connected to. This is part of your connection to self. Now, if you're not connected to self first and understand yourself, understand your inspiration in life to do what you're doing, and when you do that first spiritual principle that I talked about connecting to self first, then you can define or determine what is source to you. What source do you want to connect to? I'm not going to say be naive and say that there's no negative sources out there, that there's not a negative influence. I mean, we see it all the time. We see it in music, we see it even in art, and we see it in many, many ways where there's a destructive, creative element in people who maybe are gifted and are creative, decide to tap into a darker source. And that this darker source creates something that inspires the generations, inspires people, inspires a group to do something that's negative. So they've used their gift, which I believe is God-given anyway, but they've used their gift to tap into a darker source. And other people, on the other hand, will use their gift to tap into a lighter source. And you can tell that these things are in conflict because these people won't get along. They won't produce the same content. They produce a different result and they produce a different feeling even in you. So when you consume this content, and I've always said that before I listen to an artist's music, that I can listen to an artist and tell the source of their content. And again, this is only because I have had a lot of spiritual practice. I know myself pretty well, and I also believe that I know the source pretty well. I've seen the source work in a positive way, and I've seen the source work in a negative way, both in my life and in other people's lives as well. So I'm very familiar with what the dark source looks like, and I'm very familiar with what the positive light source looks like as well. And so through experience, through my life experience and through my spiritual life experience and through my studying and meditation and everything else like that, I've been able to discern what is a good source and what is a bad source. And so sometimes when I listen to music and I hear the nature of the music and I'm like, man, you know what? This music sounds really good. It sounds absolutely wonderful. It's musically and sonically perfect. But then you start listening to what the music is doing to you and you're like, oh, I feel a bit angry now. Yeah, my pride's going up now. Yeah, you know what? I feel like I can fight that person. Yeah, you know what? I feel like I'm going to talk to that girl or do something to this guy and then et cetera, right? So the source is now influencing you, which is why I spoke about when you're in this theta state, this dream state, that in this realm, you can have a download, a spiritual download from this source. And if you're not careful, the source will inspire you to create something that's actually quite damaging, right? And in the same token, when I listen to certain music and I'm like, man, you know what? I'm listening to this music and it's powerful and it's like, it's sonically good. Even the words sound positive, but I still don't feel positively inspired. So sometimes you can have music that sounds good on the surface, right? And you can listen to, maybe it's religious music, it's supposed to be religious music or Christian music, and you're listening to it and you're thinking, you know, I'm hearing the words, the words are saying something positive, but I'm really not inspired to connect to the source. I'm not inspired to connect to God or praise God. This is just sounding good. This is just music that's made by someone who is just trained in music and they know how to make good sounding music, but there's no actual source of connection. So when we're looking at creating from the source and we're looking at downloading spiritual downloads and having this inspiration, one of the things I'd say is try and develop that spiritual muscle where you can actually discern the spirit of the song. There's certain times when growing up and I remember I'd be listening to music and I'd say, yeah, this person's really good. The music sounds really sonically really good, but I just don't like them. And people were like, how can you say that this music is not good? And I'd be like, well, I just don't know. For me, it just doesn't resonate with me. And at the time I didn't know what was going on. And then only to find out that this person is actually involved in other spiritual practices, which are quite negative. And I'm like, oh, that makes sense, because I kind of felt that. There's been times when, you know, people even close to me spoke about someone in our family and they were like, oh man, this person's doing something that's really good and they're doing X, Y, Z and they're going to church and they're doing, and I was like, nah, you know what? I don't buy that. I don't know why, but I don't buy what they're saying. I don't buy what they're doing. And then it turns out that this person was actually doing something that was really quite bad. And I was like, well, yeah, there you go. I'm not surprised. Now, I'm not saying this to say that I'm special. I don't think that I am special. I think that we all have a connection to source and we can all tap into either one of these sources, the positive source or the negative source. Now, I do also believe that when we come into this world, we come into this world with a purpose. That there are certain people who are more attuned to the light source and there are certain people who are more attuned to the dark source. Now, here's what I really believe. I believe that most people are neither bad or good, but that most people are vulnerable to being exploited by the negative or the positive, that they can go either way. And an example of this is people who were in Nazi Germany who would have been normal people, right? But then when Hitler came into power, those people either followed and just did whatever they were told to do. They didn't rebel against it. They didn't think it was necessarily right, but they didn't necessarily fight against it as well. The vast majority of people fall into that camp where if things change today, they'll simply follow whatever is going on. They'll simply follow the crowd. And then there's a few that are really, 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 really evil that relish this opportunity to really dive into that negative, that darkness, and to really experience that and to push that forward and to move that vehicle forward in the darkness that it moved into, right? And then there's this very small minority as well on the other side who are really fighting against it. So there is this tendency for most of us. In fact, I would argue that it's less than 5% of people in the world who are actually really evil, and less than 5% of the people who are in the world who are actually really, really good and righteous. So here's how I put this, that there are people in this world who are naturally drawn to the darkness. And this 5% is based on scientific study that say that around about 3% of the world's population is psychopathic and sociopathic, what about that? And so these people, no matter how good their lives are, no matter how good you treat them, no matter how kind you are to them, they'll always be drawn to that darkness because that's something that's just indwelling within them, right? And there are those who are, again, that 5 to 3%. Now, I don't necessarily have science to back this up, but I look at people and I say, in a room of 100 people, if something wrong is going on, who are the 5 people? Or are they 10 people? Are they 20 people? Or are they just about maybe 5 people that stand up and say, you know what, even though I'm going to be put at risk, even though I'm going to be at harm of being killed potentially, I'm still going to do the right thing. How many of that is there? How many of there in the room of 100 people are actually going to stand up and say, this is wrong, I don't believe in it, and even if there's going to be a massive consequences to it, I'm still going to do the right thing? I think that's about 5%. So that's why I say that, right? So when I'm looking at people in general, that's what I would often say is that, most people are neither, right? Most people will tip depending on which way the scales weigh, right? Depending on which way the weight goes, hey, they're going to be good because everything is good. Life is good and I'm going to be good, right? Great. Oh, things are getting tougher. Maybe, no, things are not so good for me now. I need to exploit some people and then they end up becoming bad, right? So Most people are on this scale, but there's a select few that are particularly bad and a select few that are particularly good. That's how I look at spiritual influences. That even as you're creating music, right, you can either do the normal thing, the neutral thing, to say, what's being created right now? What is the music that's being created right now? You know what? This sounds hot right now, so I'm going to make that music. I'm going to create this kind of art because that's what's going on right now, right? And then there are those groundbreaking people, those people right at the top of their game, who are either using that negative influence to create music that's really negative, or really using that positive influence to create that positive music. Now, here's where things get a lot more complicated, because if you know anything about the music industry and the world that we're in right now, you will understand that there's a lot more music of a negative influence that thrives in this particular generation that we're in. And in fact, this has been happening for the past few decades, I'd say, where music has changed, where if you listen to music that was maybe in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, you can tell how gradually the music has become more and more, for lack of a better word, vulgar, if you like, right? That there's certain taboos that were not being spoken about before that are now being quite normalized. There are certain things that people would consider to be not virtuous that people are now proud of saying and doing, things that they couldn't do 20 years ago or say. So music, the music industry, as you can possibly tell, is a place that's inspired by this dark energy, this dark source. And so when you're looking at music, when you're creating your music, you could look at that and go, well, you know what? The music industry right now is leaning towards this darker source, this darker energy. And so I'm going to tap into that darkness. I'm going to tap into that creative darkness, and I'm going to create something because I know that the market's going to respond to this. And there was a very famous actor by the name of Damson Idris, and he's an actor, and he talked about when he was doing this film and creating this role in the series Snowfall, that he had to tap into a darker energy, to tap into the mind of a killer and the mind of a ruthless person. And he was even channeling the devil. Now, crazy, right? That he would say that he would channel the devil. But he also talked about how he started to have nightmares. He started to not be able to sleep. He started to see things when he was trying to sleep, that the things that he was conjuring up in the spiritual realm started to trouble him in the physical realm, in his conscious life. And so when we spoke about the theta state, remember I talked about knowing and understanding the implications of tapping into this realm. This is one of the implications of that. Is that when you tap into this negative source, you have no idea what you could be tapping into and what you could be bringing out. And so he had to go through a lot to kind of come out of that. And I don't quite know the full story in terms of like how he came out of that. Maybe he's still battling those demons. I don't know. And I hope that if he hasn't, then I hope that he's managed to come out of that. But in the same token, I know there's certainly a lot of artists who go through the same experience, who tap into this darkness. And there's a famous artist right now by the name of Doja Cat who's just made a song where she's essentially talking about how she's a demon, and she talks about all these things that she's done and those things that she's doing, and she's not fully herself. It's a very graphic video. One of her latest songs is a very graphic song. I don't even really want to show the imagery of it because it's just, I think it's just absolutely ungodly. But, you know, it's one of those things when you think about the industry and you look at people like that who do so well in the industry. That Damson Idris in Hollywood has done so fantastically well because of the role that he plays. And if you think of his inspiration and where he's taken his inspiration from this unrighteous place, and then you look at Doja Cat, who's also done the same thing with her music, and she's taken this inspiration from this unrighteous place, and these are the people that are being put on the top and being given the platform. And then you look around and you say, well, where's the good music? In fact, you look at the artists that we work with a lot of the time, who are what I would call just your normal everyday artists who are making music that is truly authentic, that is truly inspired. It's not negative, I can tell that. And in fact, when I listen to it, I feel like, man, this music really makes me want to connect to my loved ones. And when I listen to this music, I say, this is good. But the market, the industry, doesn't promote this music. Because this music would actually promote togetherness. It would promote closeness. It would promote a different feeling that would, in effect, change how you and I feel about ourselves, how you and I relate to each other. And then when we begin to relate to each other better, obviously it creates a better world. So if you're an artist, if you're a creative person, because listen, I work with artists all the time. I see artists all the time. One of the reasons why we've built our platform is to create a space for artists who are creating music that is inspired by goodness. Now, does this mean that you can't use the platform if you feel like your music is slightly more negative? Hey, you can use the platform regardless of who you are, right? I'm not here to be the moral judge of your music or your art, right? That's not why I'm here. But what I'm saying is we want to build a place and a platform that artists can actually come to where they don't feel like the industry will suppress their music, where they don't feel like they'll have to toe the line and create a certain type of music that's going to be negative in order to make money. So we're building this platform with you in mind because we believe that the art that you create is a gift from God, right? That the art that you create, whether you make it with positive intent or negative intent, that is still a gift that comes from God, and that at some point it'll serve people. So if that's you and you're an artist and you want to be on a platform that's geared towards you, an independent artist who's creating music maybe with no desire to influence people in the negative way, but just to put your music out there and see what people say, then be a part of 7th Century Music. We would love to be a part of your journey. We'd love to have your music on our platform. And if you are creating music, if you want to create music and maybe you are diving into that kind of realm of trying to understand yourself spiritually, then I would say that, take the moment to meditate upon your music and really figure out what it is you want your music to do. Because if you're not fully aware, if you're not fully sure, right? Remember I talked about most people are neutral. I think a lot of artists are in that neutral phase where they're like, I'm not sure whether I should make my music more righteous or less righteous. If I make myself more edgy, I can be more relevant. But that's not really me. And if that's you, then I encourage you to find yourself and to really figure out what it is that you want to be doing with your voice in the industry. Because, hey, alone you might feel like it's just me. If I do this thing by myself, I make no difference to anyone. But what happens if there's 10 of you? There's 50 of you. Maybe there's 100 of you. Maybe there's 1,000. And eventually tens of thousands of you who are in the spotlight, in the limelight, who are doing things that have a positive light, who are influencing people. Now, I believe that every artist should aim to get at least 1,000 fans. So if you can imagine, if there's 1,000 of you who are making this music and each of you have 1,000 fans, that means you've all impacted about 1 million people, right? Now, I know that for a fact, there's a lot more artists who intend to make music with a good reason, for the right reasons, than they are the artists who intend to make music with the negative reasons. So if that's you and you're that kind of artist, then 7th Century Music is the platform for you. And if you're watching this video, even if you don't release your music on 7th Century Music, even if you release your music on all those platforms, on Spotify and YouTube and everywhere else, even if you're there, I still want you to use your music for the right reasons. I still want you to use your music for good. I still want you to use your gift for good, because that's what I believe ultimately we're all put here to do. Of course, this is my moral standpoint. Guilty as charged. But that's what I believe. So anyway, if you like this video, if you enjoyed this video, if you felt inspired by this video, I'd like you to do me a favor, subscribe to our channel, because we are just starting out here. We're trying to build our own audience. We're trying to spread this message to other people as well, so that they can learn more about what we're trying to teach and have this positive influence in their lives. So if that's you, do me a favor, please subscribe to this channel. And if you really liked it, and if you felt like this particular post gave you some valuable insight, then do like the post and maybe share it with some people that you think would also benefit from it as well. So I do one of these videos every single week. Join me again next week when we'll talk about more cool, inspirational stuff in music and philosophy. Thank you again for your time. Love as always. Take care. Bye-bye.